4. 2004 Sri Lanka tsunami train wreck. Sri Lanka's number 50 Matara Express train regularly ran between the cities of Colombo and Galle, running only 660 feet from the shoreline along the island nation's southwestern coast. Around 7 o'clock in the morning on December 26, 2004, the train left Colombo's Fort Station with over 1,500 paying passengers and an unknown number of government officials and others. During the ride, a 9.0 magnitude earthquake happened in the Indian Ocean, with the epicenter located right off northern Sumatra in Indonesia. The effects were far-reaching and could be felt throughout Sri Lanka and neighboring countries, but officials didn't think it was possible for a tsunami to reach the island from that distance. They were unfortunately very wrong. When authorities started issuing tsunami warnings, they managed to stop 8 or so trains, but they couldn't reach the Matara Express, and by then, employees at stations further down the line had already fled or were killed by the massive waves. All efforts to stop the train failed. The Matara Express came to a halt around 9:30 a.m. when the first of several large waves struck the village of Paralia. As the water began to rise around the locomotive, an alarm sounded to warn locals about the tsunami and oncoming danger. Some residents climbed on top of rail cars, mistakenly believing the train was securely on the track, while others stood behind the cars, thinking it would protect them from the wave's force. Panic quickly spread as the water filled the carriages, only for another wave to come barreling through just 10 minutes later, lifting rail cars off the tracks and smashing them against nearby homes and trees. The passengers trapped inside weren't able to get the doors open and drowned, while those who had taken refuge on top of and behind the cars were either violently thrown or crushed to death. When all was said and done, the train had been carried almost 330 feet before it came to rest in a swamp, where some of the cars remain to this day. Based on the damage, officials estimated that the water levels rose somewhere between 25 and 30 feet above sea level and 6.6 to 9.8 feet above the tops of the rail cars. Sadly, immediate rescue was impossible thanks to how overwhelmed the local authorities, emergency responders, and military were by the devastation. In fact, it took hours for the wreck to even be found. One survivor, British national Shenth Ravindra, told CNN that he didn't know what was going on when the train suddenly jerked to a stop. The 25-year-old remembered seeing terror on other people's faces as the train was carried off the tracks and the weight of the water began to tilt the carriages. By the time he saw the second wave, the water inside Ravindra's car had risen up to his neck. He said that the second wave was so huge, it took up over 85% of the horizon. Ravindra described the tsunami as a wall of water that looked more like a cliff face than a wave as it barreled straight toward shore. He was lucky enough to get out of the train and onto the roof of a house it smashed into, where he proceeded to climb to the highest part of the rooftop with other survivors. The sheer force of the tsunami caused the foundation of the house to shake and pushed a palm tree so hard that it cut through the house. At some point, Ravindra got so worried about the stability of the building that he decided to try swimming to safety. He said he had to push his way through a sea of dead bodies on his way to dry land. Luckily, he made it, and a local resident welcomed him into their home, where he used their phone to call the British Embassy and get refuge. Only 150 people survived the train wreck, according to authorities, who estimated that somewhere between 1,700 and 2,000 people were lost that day. Only 900 or so bodies were officially recovered, while an unknown number of others were taken by grieving relatives or swept out to sea. What would you do if you were riding a train and suddenly saw a giant wave in the distance? Tell us in the comments below. If you liked the video so far, be sure to subscribe. 3. Saint Michel de Morien derailment. One of the worst train derailments in history happened on December 12, 1917. when over 1,000 French soldiers were headed home from the Italian front to spend time with loved ones for the holidays. Their commander thought that giving them leave would boost their morale, but most of the men never even made it home to see their families in the first place. The 19 train cars carrying the troops were in extremely poor condition. Many of the cars either had faulty brakes or no brakes at all, and the brakes that did actually work were in extremely bad shape. Simply put, there were too many cars and not enough combined braking power. And to add to the list of problems, there was only one engine instead of the two a train of its size would normally have. Records show that the locomotive was also too crowded for the steep hills it had to climb. The paperwork listed the number of passengers at 982, which was already over capacity. But to make matters worse, there were probably additional people on the train who weren't included in the official passenger count. The engineer initially refused to leave the station in southeastern France, but the decision was overridden by his superiors and was met with catastrophic results. Shortly after departing in the middle of the night, the train began a steep downhill descent. The driver went as slow as they possibly could, going just 6 miles per hour at first. 7 brakemen were tasked with pulling the brakes on certain cars when the locomotive's whistle signaled them to do so. But it wasn't enough to stop the beaten-up train from accelerating uncontrollably and reaching speeds as high as 84 miles per hour as it barreled down the tracks with no stop in sight. Braking was completely ineffective with the train's heavy load. The driver lost control entirely, and the train derailed while going down a steep 3.3 grade slope. As the wooden coaches smashed into one another, the overheated brakes and candles that were burning thanks to faulty electricity caused the train to erupt into flames. To make things worse, some of the soldiers were carrying grenades and other explosives on them, even though they were told not to. And because the flames broke out in a small area between 2 high mountains, there was little room for the heat to escape. The engineer was so busy with trying to get the brakes to work that he didn't even notice that some of the cars had derailed until he reached the next station at Saint-Michel de Morien, where he finally managed to get the train to stop. Once he noticed the missing cars, he and several Scottish soldiers at the station went straight to the accident site to help. In the meantime, a station attendant who witnessed the derailment from a distance held a train full of British soldiers from proceeding forward, successfully preventing a head-on collision and staving off even more tragedy and loss of life. Of the nearly 600 bodies that were pulled from in and around the wreckage, over 135 were unidentifiable due to their injuries. More than 100 men died at the hospital or on the way there, and only 183 of the train's passengers reported for duty the next day. The fire raged on until the night after the derailment, with the total number of deaths numbering somewhere between 675 and 800. For nearly a century, the accident remained a classified secret, and the military forced the press to stay almost completely silent in order to avoid certain officers being implicated in the wreck. 6 men were court-martialed, but were ultimately acquitted of their charges. 2. The Guadalajara train disaster. While Europe was caught up in the throes of World War I at the beginning of 1915, North America was undergoing changes of its own, and the Mexican Revolution was in full swing. 2 years before, in 1913, President Francisco Madero was assassinated. It left the country in a chaotic power vacuum that quickly erupted into violence, while 2 politicians, Pancho Villa and Venustiano Carranza, challenged the new president, Victoriano Huerta's authority. Carranza was installed as the new leader, but Villa himself had become power-hungry by then, so the two found themselves at odds. In early 1915, Carranza's troops captured Villa's base in southern Mexico. This was a major victory for Carranza, and he wanted to celebrate. To mark the special occasion, he arranged for the families of his soldiers to travel to the base on a 20-car train. It left the western state of Colima with about 900 passengers aboard. The locomotive was so dangerously overcrowded that some passengers were riding on the roof and clinging on to the undercarriage below. At some point during the journey, the engineer lost control of the train while going down a steep hill. As the train plunged forward a lot faster than it was designed for, the engineer desperately hit the brakes. But they tragically failed. Passengers started to fly out of cars as it picked up speed, and the entire train eventually careened off the track and plummeted into the canyon down below. Less than 300 people survived the disaster that day, which remains the deadliest rail accident in North American history. The official casualty count was put at 600, although the exact number will never be known since the passenger count was most likely inaccurate to begin with. And sadly, the tragedy didn't stop there. When Carranza's troops, many of whom were Yaqui Native Americans, heard of their family members' deaths, some of them were so overwhelmed with grief that they decided to take their own lives. Others vowed to get revenge on the train's crew members for not preventing the disaster, but the entire crew died in the accident. Word didn't travel as fast back then as it does now, and it took a while for news of the accident to spread throughout the continent. In March 1915, almost 2 months after the derailment, the San Jose Mercury Herald reported that the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions in Boston, Massachusetts, received a letter about the crash from a representative on Mexico's west coast. The note, dated February 14th, was written by Mrs. John Howland, who escaped Guadalajara during the violence with her husband and another man, Louis R. Fritz. They got on the first train to leave the area after the deadly incident. When the board received the correspondence, they were unsure of the trio's whereabouts, but believed they had made it to northern Mexico and were on their way to the United States. The letter described how people were thrown from both sides of the train as it helplessly barreled into the abyss. It also noted how almost no one was left untouched by the wreck. Out of the 300 people who survived, only 6 were uninjured. 1. Bihar train derailment. 1981 had a particularly harsh monsoon season in India. Winds were strong, water levels rose dramatically, and conditions ultimately spelled disaster for passenger trains. Between January and September, there were 526 train derailments. The deadliest accident of the year by far, though, happened in the state of Bihar in the northern region of the country. It was heading to Saharsa with over 1,000 passengers crammed on board, when 7 of its 9 cars derailed on a bridge and fell into the Bagmati River. Hundreds of people died in the wreck. It took emergency responders a while to reach the remote site, and the wait only increased the number of deaths. According to official estimates, somewhere between 800 and 2,000 people were killed, although some experts have put the number at around 600. Either way, the accident was unspeakably tragic. When help finally did get there, the rescue and recovery effort took days because of the harsh conditions and sheer number of victims involved. Hundreds of bodies were never recovered, partially because of the hazards posed by the rushing river waters and because many locals refused to help with the search due to the social taboos associated with touching dead bodies. While the weather was undeniably bad, the exact reasons for the derailment have remained unclear to this day. According to some accounts, the driver slammed on the brakes to avoid hitting a cow standing on the tracks. Other explanations point towards slippery rails, deadly river conditions, strong winds, and other hazards posed by the abnormally heavy rainfalls, which not only made the wreck more deadly than it otherwise would have been, but also prevented rescue and life-saving help from getting there sooner. Experts also blamed the derailment on the fact that the train was loaded past its design capacity. In other words, it was carrying more passengers than it was meant to, especially since there were likely a number of non-paying riders who weren't included in the official passenger count, which was dangerously high to begin with. It would have been impossible to assess the exact number of passengers with how packed the train was, according to India Today. Some reports even claimed that there were hundreds of people riding on the roofs of the cars too. While the causes of the derailment remain disputed to this day, nobody seems to disagree that it was the deadliest train accident in India's locomotive history. Thanks for watching. Which of these accidents surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.